In Hollywood, there are people who tell stories for a living, and then there are people who become stories when no one is ready. Here's the contradiction that makes this case impossible to ignore. A man celebrated for speaking about morality, justice, and accountability. A family that, according to emerging reports, may have been quietly unraveling for years. And a violent ending so stark that it forced even the most careful observers to stop, reread the headlines, and ask a question that feels almost inappropriate, but unavoidable. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. How does something like this happen here? Not in a back alley, not in a story we can comfortably distance ourselves from, but inside a $13.5 million estate in Brentwood. Inside a family whose name carries weight, influence, and decades of public trust. On Sunday, Rob Reiner, 78, and his wife Michelle, 70, were found stabbed to death in their home. Their son, Nick Reiner, 32, who lived in a guest house on the same property, was arrested that night. He now faces 2 counts of first-degree murder. Those are the facts as they stand. Cold, formal, almost deceptively clean. But facts don't explain atmosphere. They don't explain silence. They don't explain why some people, long before this happened, were allegedly worried, and why those worries never seemed to land anywhere solid. And that's where this story begins to feel different. Because almost immediately, there were whispers, not online speculation, not anonymous comments, but reported statements, alleged warnings, quiet remarks from people who were close enough to know better, and far enough away to feel powerless. One report claims the bodies were discovered by the Reiner's daughter, Romy, 27, and that she told police something that would later echo through every serious discussion of this case. She allegedly said there was a dangerous family member, someone who should be a suspect. Pause on that for a second. Imagine what it takes to say that out loud. Not about a stranger, not about someone outside the family, but about someone inside it. If that allegation is accurate, and investigators will ultimately determine what weight it carries, it reframes everything. Not as a sudden, unthinkable act, but as something that may have existed quietly long before Sunday night. And then there's the name that keeps surfacing in hushed tones. Billy Crystal, a man known for humor, for warmth, for decades of proximity to Hollywood's most powerful circles. According to multiple accounts now circulating, Crystal may have let something slip. Not a confession, not an accusation, but a remark, contextual, understated, that suggested knowledge of family issues never meant for public consumption. Was it a mistake? Was it misinterpreted? Or was it one of those moments where truth leaks out not because someone wants it to, but because holding it in for too long becomes exhausting? We don't know yet. And anyone claiming certainty is lying to you. What we do know is this. When a story this tightly controlled suddenly fractures, it rarely does so without pressure building beneath the surface for a very long time. The initial headlines moved fast. Arrest, charges, ages, property value, the familiar rhythm of breaking news. But beneath that rhythm, there's another tempo, slower, heavier, harder to hear unless you're listening for it. It's the sound of a family history being re-examined in reverse. Because the question investigators are now circling isn't just what happened on Sunday. It's what happened in the years before it. What dynamics were normalized? What behaviors were excused? What warnings were minimized because acknowledging them would have required uncomfortable action? There are allegations, carefully worded, legally cautious, but deeply unsettling, that Nick Reiner may have been physically abused multiple times. Allegations, not proven facts. Claims that must be treated with restraint, but claims that, if substantiated, complicate the emotional logic of this case without excusing its outcome. And that's the line we have to walk here. Understanding is not forgiveness. Context is not justification. An explanation is not absolution. This isn't about rushing to defend anyone. It's about resisting the urge to simplify something that may be structurally complex and emotionally brutal. Because Hollywood loves clean narratives. Heroes and villains fall from grace. Monster revealed. But real families don't collapse that neatly. They fracture. Slowly. Quietly. Often invisibly. Neighbors rarely hear screams. Friends see curated versions. Even children raised in the same house can experience entirely different realities. Nick lived on the property, but not in the main house. Close enough to be present. Separate enough to be unseen. What does that arrangement say about proximity and distance? About connection and containment? And what happens when containment fails? These are not comfortable questions. They are not questions with viral-friendly answers. But they are the only questions that matter if we're serious about understanding how this ended the way it did. There's another discomfort we need to address early. Rob Reiner wasn't just a private citizen. He was a public moral voice. A man unafraid to criticize, to lecture, to demand accountability from others. That doesn't make him guilty of anything beyond what evidence supports. But it does mean the contrast between public conviction and private allegations will be examined relentlessly. Not because of cruelty, but because hypocrisy, real or perceived, changes how people process tragedy. And when power is involved, scrutiny is not optional. It's inevitable. Still, this is not a story about tearing down a legacy for sport. It's about understanding how legacies can sometimes obscure warning signs instead of illuminating them. The danger here, especially online, is that people rush to choose sides before the ground has stopped shifting. Some will say this was inevitable. Others will say it was unimaginable. Both reactions miss something essential, because inevitability implies certainty, and imagination requires honesty. We are still in the early phase of this case. Charges have been filed, but trials have not been held. Evidence will be contested. Narratives will evolve. And yet, even now, certain details refuse to sit quietly. A daughter allegedly naming a threat. A son living in emotional isolation. A friend possibly speaking out of turn. A household where fear may have existed long before violence made it visible. This is not a story to be consumed quickly. It's not one to be shouted over background noise. It requires patience and restraint and a willingness to sit with uncertainty. As we move forward, we're going to do something deliberately unfashionable. We're going to slow this down. We're going to look at the timeline not just from the night of the killings, but from the years that preceded them. We're going to separate what is known from what is claimed. We're going to let contradictions stand long enough for their weight to register. And we're going to ask questions that don't have clean answers yet. Because if there is one thing this case already makes clear, it's this. The most important parts of the story didn't begin on Sunday. They were already in motion, quietly, invisibly, long before police lights arrived at the gate. And what comes next isn't the violence itself. It's the moment when the public story collides with the private one. When timelines tighten. When silence breaks. When investigators stop asking what happened and start asking why. Because the night the story broke was only the surface. And once we look beneath it, nothing appears as simple as it first seemed. But to understand how everything unraveled, we have to go back to the first hours, the first reports, and the moment when this tragedy stopped being a rumor and became a case that would force everyone involved into the light. The first hours after the discovery of the Reiners' bodies were chaotic, but in a way that was almost clinical. The media blitz had not yet caught up, and law enforcement was working quietly to reconstruct events that, for everyone involved, had already taken on an almost surreal quality. Neighbors described seeing emergency vehicles arrive, lights flashing against the manicured lawns of Brentwood, but no one could articulate exactly what had happened. It was only when statements began to trickle in that the first pieces of a much larger puzzle started to take shape. Police reports indicate that Romy, the Reiner's daughter, was the one who first discovered her parents. She was reportedly the person who raised the alarm and, according to sources, made a statement that would later draw intense scrutiny. She warned of a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. It is not just the factual content of that claim that is significant, it's the timing. Consider the emotional weight of telling police, in the immediate aftermath of what would become a tragedy, that you had long suspected a threat within your own family. That is a statement heavy with dread, but also with a sense of clarity about danger that others around her may have refused to see. And then there is Nick, 32, the son who lived on the same property in a guest house. One could imagine the psychological pressures of such proximity, yet emotional separation. Imagine existing in the same space, surrounded by family and legacy, while simultaneously being an outsider in the world that should have been your own. Reports suggest a fraught dynamic, not always visible to outsiders, and not always acknowledged by those closest to him. Was there tension? Perhaps. Was there unaddressed conflict? Almost certainly. The details are fragmentary, yet the implications are profound. A household divided, with undercurrents that would only become tragically visible in the most extreme way. Then there's the question of the alleged abuse claims. These are, for now, unverified allegations, but their mere existence casts long shadows over the narrative. Multiple sources have indicated that Nick may have been physically abused. We do not know the full context, the frequency, or the circumstances. Those are questions for investigators and, eventually, for a court of law. But we must pause on the fact that such allegations complicate the narrative. They introduce a moral ambiguity that cannot be ignored. Abuse, if proven, does not excuse violence, but it does inform how patterns of control, fear, and familial dysfunction may have evolved. The alleged comments by Billy Crystal add another layer to this already complex tableau. Known for humor, charm, and a career intertwined with Hollywood's most prominent figures, Crystal reportedly made remarks suggesting he was aware of tension or danger within the Reiner family. These were not statements meant for the media, yet the idea that someone with his proximity could inadvertently hint at internal strife creates an almost cinematic contrast. The public, light-hearted figure juxtaposed with private, escalating turmoil. Was it a slip of the tongue? Was it a casual observation misinterpreted? Or was it a signal that even Hollywood insiders knew the warning signs long before anyone else did? Consider the emotional landscape of this story. The public perceives a family shaped by fame, affluence, and status. The private reality, as emerging reports suggest, is far more complicated. Isolation, tension, unaddressed allegations, and a proximity that magnifies every conflict. A home in Brentwood, surrounded by wealth and appearances, becomes a stage where subtle dysfunction festers. It's a reminder that money, fame, and social prestige do not inoculate a family from tragedy. As we reflect on these dynamics, pause for a moment and ask, what role does silence play in tragedies like this? Romy allegedly raised a warning. The question is, how seriously was it taken? How do we reconcile the difference between private concern and public inaction? These are questions that haunt the edges of every report, every statement, and every witness account. And they are questions that will follow investigators and the public alike for months, if not years. The media coverage in the immediate aftermath focused on arrest details, property values, and the ages of those involved. It was the familiar cadence of breaking news, short sentences, shocking headlines, quick takes. But beneath the headlines was a more intricate story, one that could not be captured in a 250-word article or a 10-second news clip. It is the story of relationships, warning signs, and decisions, small and large, that accumulated over years, ultimately converging in violence. There is also an inherent tension in reporting this story responsibly. On one hand, there is public interest, fueled by the prominence of those involved. On the other, there is the need for restraint, for separating verified fact from allegation, for resisting the siren call of sensationalism. Every claim, every report, every alleged statement must be weighed carefully. Yet, even in the act of caution, the story remains compelling because human behavior, especially within families, is rarely tidy. It's worth noting that the age differences within the family, the living arrangements, and the dynamics of proximity create psychological complexities that are difficult to parse. Nick's life in the guest house may have shielded him from daily friction, but it also isolated him. Romy's experience of the main house and her perspective as a witness to both history and immediate danger gave her a vantage point that others may have lacked. Each individual in the family existed in overlapping yet distinct realities, which helps explain why tragedy can sometimes feel simultaneously sudden and long anticipated. And here lies the paradox of this story. Everything appears straightforward when summarized in bullet points. Parents found dead. Son arrested. Alleged warnings. Alleged abuse. Famous friend potentially aware of tension. But the human reality is far more tangled. It is full of contradictions, hesitations, and ambiguities. It is not a story that yields neat answers. And that is precisely what makes it so compelling and so necessary to examine slowly, methodically, and with care. We are now at the point where the surface narrative, the immediate news cycle, meets the deeper, slower story that only emerges with investigation. A daughter's warning, a son's isolation, unverified allegations of abuse, a friend's accidental remark, a public persona at odds with private turmoil. All these threads are beginning to converge. And when threads converge, they create pressure. Pressure that, in this case, erupted in violence. So as we continue, the goal is not to sensationalize. It is not to assign guilt outside the courts. It is to understand the architecture of this tragedy, the structural tensions, the warning signs, the human psychology, and the sequences of events that led to a moment no one could have prepared for. Because if there is one lesson already apparent, it is this. The headlines of Sunday night captured the violence, but they barely hint at the human, emotional, and relational currents that brought it into being. Those currents are what we will explore next. The details are fragmented, the testimonies cautious, and the implications profound.